All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the sixth general meeting of Energy Club. Glad you all could make it. Hope everyone is both enjoying the warmer weather and staying safe. If you haven't already signed in, the link is here, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So, again, as a reminder, we do record our meetings so that folks who can't watch during our normal time can watch these asynchronously. If you feel comfortable turning on your camera, that would be awesome. But if not, or if you'd like to use a virtual background, both of those things also work. Feel free to email me or chat me during the meeting if you have any concerns. We are looking into being participants in more of Mississippi Park Connection and Great River Greening's activities this semester. Great River Greening doesn't get started until a little bit later when it starts to really get warm, but Mississippi Park Connection does have some more things scheduled. So if you're interested in getting involved with things like this tree identification that some of us were able to do a couple of weeks back, feel free to fill out this form, the when to meet, at this Z link here, and we can then let you know once we find out more about upcoming opportunities. We're also we're chugging along with book club. We're almost halfway through Braiding Sweetgrass. It's been awesome. We've had some really good reflection and had some very interesting discussions. So we're also going to start reading another book in another month or so, just before spring break begins. And it's an interesting read. It's Sustainable Planet, edited by Juliet Shore and Betsy Taylor are the two editors of the book. And it's a collection of really interesting essays. So if you're interested in joining us for that, maybe if you have a little bit more time in the second part of the semester, feel free to send us an email and we can let you know when we start reading. If you've been reading along with Braiding Sweetgrass, but you haven't been able to make the meetings, please feel free to join us. It would be awesome to have you to join us in our discussions. We're also planning some movie screenings for the semester, excuse me. And there's a number of films that we're looking at. However, in order to figure out what day we want to have that screening, we want to know when you all are free. So if you can fill out this interest form by Saturday night, then we can sort of figure out when that's going to be and send an announcement. So if you have any questions, or if you have particular movie recommendations that you think would be really interesting for the group, feel free to send Megan an email, and this is her email address. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Val for their Sust chat.
Hi, I'm Valerie. I'm a sophomore, majoring in English with minors in linguistics and creative writing. And I'm interested in both the scientific and humanitarian perspectives on energy and sustainability. And I'm especially focused on where those scientific and humanitarian areas meet, because both my parents are engineers. I spent all of last year in CSE, so I have a strong, scientific background, but I'm now in the humanities, and I'm looking for ways to sort of compile those two aspects of my life together. And, especially accessibility within energy and sustainability, and just making a better planet for our future and the future of those who come after us. And then, give me just a sec. Is the presentation showing?
Yep, I can see it clear.
Okay, cool. So what I am going to talk about, and I don't know if the chat works when I have this optimized for video, so feel free to unmute yourselves and interrupt me at any point if you have questions, comments, concerns. But what I'm going to talk about is our national park system, its history, its present day form, and its future in terms of conservation and colonialism. So before we start, I want to make a couple of acknowledgements. The first is a land acknowledgement that, beyond the national parks I'll be talking about today, the land that makes up the university campus is land that was forcibly taken from the Dakota people. This land still rightfully and legally belongs to the Dakota people, who have maintained a spiritual connection to and physical presence in it to this day, and who remain a sovereign nation to this day. Please remember that when on campus, we are here as their guests, and in many cases, they're uninvited guests. And sort of bouncing off of that, I am not Native American. I have no cultural ties to the lands that have become the national parks. While I'm attempting to spread awareness about the history and continued existence of the national parks and their impact on Indigenous peoples, I cannot speak for Indigenous peoples, and it's perfectly possible that there are aspects of their stories that I will fail to cover here. I recommend that everyone take a look at some of the resources I use here, as well as looking for resources of your own. All right, let's start with the slightly more lighthearted side of the national parks and their focus on conservation. So the national parks were started in part because of landscape paintings and other art forms that romanticized the West, which grew in popularity during the 19th century. And a couple of the people who were sort of impactful in the creation of the national parks are George Catlin, who is a landscape painter, and he foresaw some great protecting policy of government preserving land in all its pristine beauty and wildness, where the world could see for ages to come the native Indian in his classic attire galloping his horse amid the fleeting herds of elks and buffaloes. And this is a quote that has been met with sort of mixed reactions from Native American people, because on one hand, he was one of the first people advocating for, keeping Native American people in their ancestral homes and, not overtaking and kicking them out. But at the same time, he was advocating for basically a zoo where tourists would come and watch Native Americans exist in their, natural native lands like some sort of exotic beings. And a lot of people have very understandably not felt super great about that part. John James Audubon, who's a wildlife artist, was another person who advocated for Native Americans to be included in the preservation of wilderness. And Henry David Thoreau, who's a writer and philosopher, believed in the preservation of humanity's relationship with nature, and he argued against the exploitation of Native people and Native lands. And especially if you've read, parts of Walden, you'll probably know that he valued Native American lifestyles, and he attempted to learn from Native American peoples and their relationships with the land, but he still saw Native people as subhuman and was incredibly racist in that manner, which is fun. So the big thing that most people know the national parks for is their environmental aspect. One of the biggest things that they claim to do, and actually do a lot of, is protecting biodiversity by fighting invasive species, helping to prevent, overconsumption of resources by humans or animals, and trying to keep ecosystems balanced. A good example is on Isle Royale in Michigan. It's an island with population of moose and wolves. And every couple of years, ecologists will sometimes have to fly in some extra moose or some extra wolves because one of the populations just had a really good year and the moose are overeating or the wolves are overhunting or all sorts of shenanigans there. Another thing the national parks do is protect water sources from pollution, rivers, lakes, natural springs, that sort of stuff. If the source of your community's drinking water is a national park, you're far less likely to end up with, industrial sorts of pollution in there than if you're not near protected land. The national parks support resilient environments and prevent development on land. They help environments support themselves. Sort of one of their goals is to, in the future, because you always want to plan for less need for intervention in the future than you have currently. You want to help ecosystems be able to function sort of on their own with, obviously some help from human cultivation, but not being dependent on it. And then preventing the encroachment of man-made infrastructure, which is sort of a given with the protected land. And another sort of thing that they do is they help stabilize the environmental infrastructure and prevent natural disaster. Things like keeping tree roots in place and keeping those, tree and grass, a lot of grasslands, the grass roots go down 6, 8, 10 feet deep into the soil. That's holding a lot of dirt in place to prevent things like landslides and erosion. And, you know, we've all heard about like the Dust Bowl, and that came from just over cultivating land in ways that it wasn't meant to be farmed from for years and years. So now we're going to take a look at a like 3-minute-ish section from Saving the Dark, which is a film that we watched in Astro Club a couple of weeks ago. And it's the documentary on the whole. I highly recommend you watch the whole thing, but we're just right now going to watch the portion relating to national parks.
Light pollution is the one form of pollution that's relatively easy to solve.
The amazing thing about light pollution, unlike all the other work that I'd done previously with endangered species and migratory birds and wetlands restoration, it takes years and years, if not millennia, to restore those systems back to some semblance of what they were before. Whereas with light pollution, you literally can flip a switch and make a difference immediately.
U.S. national parks have become one of the best places to go to see a natural night sky. When the national parks did surveys asking visitors what did they find most special about visiting a national park, a star-filled sky is right up there with wildflowers, waterfalls, and wildlife.
National parks are such a great place to come and view the night skies because there's so few places left that don't have the intrusion of light pollution. You have naturally dark places, you also have naturally wild places. So the soundscapes and the night skies are a way for us to conserve and preserve the wildness of a place. And that's important because there's so few wild places left.
Night sky talks in national parks are the #1 ranger program given across the country.
My favorite part about doing night sky programs is seeing visitor reactions. When they realize that the Milky Way is a huge streak of stars in the sky and not a cloud, the reactions are off the wall. They just go nuts.
We've got the handle here and the top of the teapot, and the Milky Way is the steam out of the teapot.
All right, so no, that's not what I want you to do. Okay, and a lot of national parks have recently started efforts to help preserve Native American culture and to start spreading information about, you know, acknowledging the land they exist on and the knowledge and experience of the peoples who historically lived there and who continue to live in the surrounding areas. Saguaro National Park, for example, started Hands on the Land to bring Native American students to their local national park, where students, you know, performed a variety of wildlife science activities. They learned about biodiversity, and they learned about the rich ties of their park's history to their Tohono O'odham culture. Hubble Trading Post National Historic Site invited Navajo and other Native American veterans to a safe and sacred place to rest and reflect for several months over the course of 2016. And Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument has the Night Sky program, which is also covered somewhat in the Saving the Dark documentary, in which visitors walk trails and learn about both Native American and Euro-American constellations. in particular from tribal elders. And even the national parks website itself has begun to recognize, the lands that their parks exist on and sort of the impacts that those parks have had. Although, as you may notice from the sort of theme here, it is a lot of celebrating Native American heritage and not quite as much of recognizing the harms that parks may have done, which we will get into in a minute. But first, we have another video talking about Native America Speaks, which is a program running out of Glacier National Park.
I'm going to speak a little American to you, okay? And then I'll translate what I said. Okay, apami aplikon. Nisto am skapi pikani. Nitani ko. So koyo makkan. Ikotrabinako. What I just said was, hello, people from across the water. That's why my ancestors were addressed to. I'm Blackfeet, and my name is Heavy Runner, and I'll welcome you.
My name is Jack Gladstone. I'm the co-founder of Native America Speaks. This is the opening of the 35th season. The song is called Legends of Glacier, and this is my opener.
The Native America Speaks program is an opportunity for our tribal neighbors to tell their own story about their relationship to Glacier National Park and its landscape.
My dad co-founded the program over 30 years ago, so I grew up going to park programs with him, helping him with programs, running slides, doing sign language, from the time that I was born.
Native America Speaks was an effort to feature voices. We fit into the mold that we've been here a long time, and that was the authenticity of our voice, the authenticity of the Salish voice, the authenticity of the Kootenai Indians that were in this landscape.
The Kootenays have always been not very public and have been left out an awful lot. And so my goal is to make people aware of the Kootenai language and culture and their attachments to this area and how long it's been, and make people aware that we were here and we're still here.
Who I am and what I am is my people. It is my culture, it is my land. Right now we're sitting in a very, very sacred spot. These lakes, the water, the trees, everything that we harvested up here had purpose, it had meaning.
Besides being the place that I grew up, my ancestors have been here for thousands of years, and the stories that I'm telling tonight connect me to this land and give me a deeper context in terms of my own history, but also the meanings of the places here.
Their culture in this landscape is extremely important, and that's probably one of the most important things that comes out of the Native America Speaks program is that connection of people to landscape that's been here for millennia.
I called my daughter Mariah a few years ago, and she has her message. She speaks in Blackfeet first, and then she translates it. So all of a sudden, within this short lifetime, she's 26, and bursting upon the scene, there is this new generation.
Sometime when I was in college, looking at the Native America Speaks program lineup at that time, there were no women involved with the program, and I don't think anyone under the age of 50. And so I put in my own Native America Speaks application and became a Native America Speaks presenter at that time.
Native America Speaks has been the interactive reach. We have teachers from that program. We have interpreters from that program that are now involved, that can do entire programs on Blackfeet language. And how does that sensitize our people? How can that help sensitize visitors to Glacier Park?
The Native America Speaks program in itself is one of our most popular programs in the park, but it's also been a jumping off place for developing our relationship with Blackfeet and Confederated Salish and Kootenai peoples. So it's really from the Native America Speaks program. We've had many, many other programs that have come forth since then.
It's interesting because I've never known a world without the Native America Speaks program, and there would be a vacuum if it were not to exist.
With music and with song, with poetry, the awe is restored. The awe of being reintroduced to something that is almost like a forgotten landscape.
I'm just here to spread knowledge, and if one person out of 100 people can take home what I said and learn from it and keep it with them for the rest of their life, then being a presenter paid off.
I think that even though this program has been many, many years ongoing, there's still a lot to be told.
So yeah, that's just one example of some of the programs that the national parks are implementing to get, you know, Native people back involved in their traditional homelands. Nope. There we go. All right, now we're on to the slightly less savory portion. And we're gonna talk about the national parks and their history and current involvement in colonialism and colonialistic ideology. And we're starting with another video because I have several of these.
Relocate all villages, shoot on sight orders everywhere with immunity. With immunity.
So that one covers, you know, slightly more of the international aspect, but, you know, they mentioned the Native American people being moved out of their lands for conservation purposes. And so I want to talk a bit about the sort of historical precedent that the national parks have for colonialistic ideology. And, you know, racist systems and racist ideas promoted that Native Americans were inferior in some way to white people. And this occurred even when their symbiotic relationship with the land was acknowledged. People would acknowledge that, yeah, they have a symbiotic relationship with the land, they're doing good, but we can do better, or we can use this land for better purposes by our definition. And, you know, a vast number of America's national parks came out of land belonging to Native Americans or out of land originally intended for reservations, including Glacier National Park, Badlands, Mesa Verde, the Grand Canyon, and Death Valley, just to name a couple. And park systems have historically promoted land as untouched and pristine, even when it had been cultivated and cared for by Native Americans for centuries or millennia. There was this idea of, you know, this land is wild and untamed and beautiful, and it's, you know, that's land that people have been living on and interacting with for thousands of years, so that it's not untouched or, you know, truly, I guess, wild by native definitions. And we have a quick video about the history of two national parks in particular.
Growing up, my family never went to national parks. My first overnight backpacking trip wasn't until the summer after my senior year of high school. A few of my friends and I decided to walk 6 miles into a state park, only to get eyed up by a ranger and turned around because we were so clearly unprepared. It was probably the grocery bag full of loose bagels that gave us away, but despite our general cluelessness, the trip was awesome. Over the years, however, as I've read and hiked more, America's wooded parks began to unravel in front of my eyes. These pleasurable preserves were built for people who looked like me in the name of leisure, and eventually created an inaccurate vision of a world untouched by other humans. In reality, America's wilderness areas have a turbulent history. The land of some national parks like Glacier and Yellowstone was obtained through colonialism and violence, and the history of these parks is marred by disregard for treaties and the forced removal of people that lived on the land. Today I want to look at the origins of two national parks in order to historically contextualize and substantiate these claims. In 1895, two nations forged an agreement. The Blackfoot ceded roughly 800,000 acres of its land to the United States in return for a payment of $1.5 million over a 10-year period. In addition, the Blackfoot people were to retain hunting and gathering rights on the land. Part of the agreement read as follows: that the said Indians hereby reserve and retain the right to hunt upon said lands, and to fish in the streams thereof, so long as the same shall remain public lands of the United States, under and in accordance with the provisions of the game and fish laws of the state of Montana. However, this cession was not without context. The Blackfoot Nation, really a collection of 4 semi-independent tribes, including the North Piegan, South Piegan, Blood, and Northern Blackfeet, was very strong in the early 19th century. However, by 1895, their numbers had dwindled to roughly 2,000 people. Diseases like smallpox, skirmishes with other indigenous nations in the United States, and most importantly, the quick decline of buffalo as a result of overhunting by mostly white Americans, forced the Blackfoot peoples into a corner. The Blackfoot were essentially pushed into selling parcels of land in order to support themselves in the absence of buffalo. The agreement with the United States forged in 1895 was accepted grudgingly by Chief Whitecalf, who stated, "Chief Mountain is my head. Now my head is cut off. The mountains have been my last refuge." With the establishment of Glacier National Park in 1910, however, this right to the bounty of the land was ripped away. 2 years after the park's creation, a ranger arrested Blackfoot hunters and warned that they will no longer be permitted in Glacier National Park, and if found within the park, they will be summarily ejected. In 1932, this disregard for the treaty was officially recognized by a U.S. District Court, which decided that the land ceded under the treaty ceased to be deemed public after it became a national park. Thus, the 1895 agreement was slashed by a national park in the name of a pristine vision of nature. The Blackfoot Nation's right to hunt and fish on the ceded eastern section of the land was shunned in order for the park to appear untouched. In the case of Yellowstone National Park, the expulsion of the Crow, Bannock, Sheep Eaters, and Shoshone peoples proved much more forcible and violent. Initially, the US government took legal routes to expel these nations from a land they wanted to look untrammeled. However, when that failed, law enforcement approached Native American nations with violence. According to an account in the 1894 annual report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, William Manning, a Jackson Hole constable, deputized 26 men for the purpose of seeking out and arresting Native Americans that were hunting in the area. They eventually came across a Bannock camp and stripped the people of their goods, marching them at gunpoint out of the park. As they neared a heavily forested area, Manning's posse loaded their weapons, and some of the Bannock bolted in fear. The deputized men opened fire. An old man was killed and 2 children lost. The origins of Yellowstone and Glacier point to a much more complex history of national parks, one that expelled Native American nations from their lands in order to provide a pristine front for tourists. This history is essential to understanding the often untold aspects of America's wilderness areas. Back in high school, my 2 friends and I walked through the woods, enjoying the pleasantries of a state park, but that park was there for our use, for our pleasure. For many, that isn't the case. Native American practices of brush burning and game hunting were barred from places like Glacier so that 20th century recreationalists could experience the leisure and hardships of quote-unquote untrammeled land. The National Park Service has begun to recognize this darker legacy of their federally protected lands in recent years, but it's one that we need to come to grips with if we are to truly understand how to ethically and rightfully enjoy these constructed landscapes.
All right, so a little more of the historical precedent stuff. Congress's Yellowstone Act of 1872 is what started the national park movement worldwide. And a quote from part of the legislature there is, "All persons who shall locate or settle upon or occupy Yellowstone Park or any part thereof, except as hereinafter provided, shall be considered trespassers and removed therefrom." So as Yellowstone was made a national park and open to the public, it was closed to the people who had lived there for hundreds and thousands of years. And the areas that make up Yellowstone are considered sacred land to potentially up to 26 different tribes. And many of those lived in the area for most of the year, and others still traveled through and used the land for resources like hunting and obsidian on their normal migration patterns. And sort of on a slightly different note, relocation and reservations were often planned to be temporary to allow Native Americans to practice their traditional lifestyles for a while, but the end goal was often to have Native Americans assimilate entirely into Western culture, which sort of explains why some of those treaties and agreements were seemingly so easily broken by the US government. And we have a quick video about, why are our national parks so white?
Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wildness is a necessity. Those are the words of John Muir, aka John of the Mountains, aka Father of the National Parks. It's a nice quote, but our national parks haven't traditionally been a home for everyone. Like most other American institutions, the National Park Service has a pretty checkered history with race. Madison Grant, a man who helped inspire the National Parks movement, and also one of the 20th century's most influential conservationists, was a eugenicist who wrote a book that Hitler referred to as his Bible. Just this past March, Senate Democrats began investigating alleged racially motivated reassignments of top officials of color within the Department of Interior, which oversees the Park Service. Reportedly, its head, Ryan Zinke, told employees that diversity isn't important. Meanwhile, the department announced a small fee hike for national parks, after an initial plan to triple entry fees drew sharp criticism. Many Americans voiced concerns that a hike would only widen the equity gap in these wild places, where diversity among visitors is already so low. There are, however, lots of folks working to make national parks accessible to everyone. Gris joined Jose Gonzalez and his group Latino Outdoors at Mount Rainier National Park to hear more about how they're trying to change that.
Do you guys normally come out here? No, this is my first time here.
Jose began Latino Outdoors with a vision of building community.
I feel this identity and connection. Where is everybody else hanging out? We need to understand that because different communities of different backgrounds have had different equity gaps, what's normative for you and easy to access because of your privilege, it's not the starting point for a lot of the communities. We tend to talk a lot about equality and having access access for everybody, the outdoors don't judge you, like all of that. That's the conservation table that we all want to sit around. That's the vision.
To make outings more affordable, Latino Outdoors covers all transportation, entry fees, and the necessary gear. This is a big deal because cost can quickly become a barrier. While groups like Latino Outdoors are bringing new people into the parks, they're still aware of the conservation movement's troubling history. On land used by the Sheep-Eater, Shoshone, Crow, and other Indian tribes, Yellowstone became the first national park in 1872. Tensions between tribes and white settlers led to a significant military presence on Yellowstone grounds. For the first 10 years of the park's existence, it operated more like a military fort. This was on the heels of the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which allowed the federal government to acquire southern Indian land in exchange for moving west to the Mississippi. This included native homes, burial sites, and sacred land.
Well, what is really sad about the federal government is the fact that they do not recognize that every square inch of land that they're holding on to through their National Park Service was land that was ceded to them by one tribe or many tribes.
Under Jim Crow, Park Service recreational facilities and areas were either largely segregated or non-existent for people of color. Those that were available were often poorly maintained.
They were really designed for people who had the financial resources and the leisure time to visit them, and that didn't include us.
This generally meant middle and upper class whites. For many African Americans, the wilderness also called back to sites of trauma.
When you look at the woods historically, these are places where lynchings took place and escape routes for African Americans.
Culturally, some older generations of African Americans express how the outdoors might be dirty and might not have been too far removed from the living conditions of the poor and working class. Black families who did attempt to camp and road trip in those days often faced hostility and violence. So much so that Victor Hugo Green published an annual guidebook for Black road trippers from 1936 until 1966, the year after Jim Crow ended. Today, many people of color still feel unwelcome in outdoor spaces like national parks, whether through mistreatment by unfriendly fellow visitors or lack of diversity among park rangers, neither of which convey a sense of belonging. In recent years, the National Park Service has committed to increasing employee and visitor diversity, which President Obama helped along. And the agency also has various sites dedicated to African, Asian, Latino, and Native American heritage.
People of color have needs, and if we don't see value in these national parks, then we're not going to spend our money there.
Representation and visibility in the outdoors sends a message that conservation actually is a viable career path for more Americans. With demographics quickly shifting, the conservation movement needs people of color to sustain it.
To honestly say that these are public lands, that means public at large, going to continue to shift and change. So responsibility for communities of color is knowing that we need to take care of these spaces.
Thousands of
Okay. So I have a couple of quotes talking about sort of the perpetuation of colonialism within the park system. And so the first one is, tribes today contain 50 million acres and the Park Service controls approximately 80 million. And that sort of, I guess, exemplifies the inequality here of, you know, what is being preserved as this idea of pristine land and what is existing as, you know, now the land that the people who lived over the entire continent are now more or less contained into. And the other is from the closing statement from some Indigenous delegates at the Fifth World Parks Congress, which is from 2003. And it's, the declaration of protected areas on Indigenous territories without our consent and engagement has resulted in our dispossession and resettlement, the violation of our rights, the displacement of our peoples, the loss of our sacred sites, and the slow but continuous loss of our cultures, as well as impoverishment. It is thus difficult to talk about benefits for Indigenous peoples when protected areas are still being declared on our territories unilaterally. First, we were dispossessed in the names of kings and emperors, later in the name of state development, and now in the name of conservation. And so in terms of recent activism related to the parks and other protected areas. Over 12% of the world's surface is now set aside through about 100,000 protected areas. And worldwide, about 50% of these are lands traditionally used by indigenous peoples, but within the Americas, that's 80%, which is way more than it should be if the policies continue the way that they are. Indigenous peoples have been active in conservation communities worldwide for decades. They work toward conservation that doesn't violate their rights to self-determination, consent for resettlement, and owning, controlling, and managing their traditional lands and resources. And policy statements are something that a lot of conservation organizations and communities have, and they often attempt to account for indigenous people's interests, but are often either not up to par or not implemented at all. And I think we see a similar parallel sort of on campus with the land grants, where, you know, land grants are a great starting point. They're a great way to bring awareness and to make sure that people, you know, attending the U of M campus understand that, you know, this land has not always been our land. It was and should still rightfully be someone else's land that we are living, working, going to school on, but it's not a be all end all. You know, having a policy statement with flowery language that seems, you know, beautiful is not the end of the fight, it's the start of it. It's a way to push non-Indigenous people out of their comfort zones to address, you know, the underlying issues of our political landscape and infrastructure. And it's a way to start conversation and dialogue and talk about, you know, what happens next, what can we do to fix these things? Which brings us to, you know, what's next? In terms of legislation, I've got a couple more quotes. Long-term environmental change on a large scale will require that governments understand the values that they are protecting and be able to match the value with benefits. And this is in terms of sort of moving corporations off of intended protected land in whatever form that protection comes from. Governments need to understand the inherent value of what it is they are protecting, be it forests, be it lakes and rivers, be it shorelines, whatever it is they're looking at. And then the other one is sort of a continuation of the one from the Indigenous delegates earlier. The delegates asked for the establishment of a high-level independent Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indigenous peoples and protected areas. The commission will investigate and then respond impartially to historical cases of violations and abuses of Indigenous peoples' rights associated with the creation of protected areas. It will also promote healing and reconciliation and have appropriate mechanisms for restitution and redress of grievances. And from what I was able to find, there is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Canada started in, I believe it was 2008, but I have not been able to find one for the US. And sort of tying in with the first quote from the last slide, the idea that nature provides us with free goods is deeply rooted. It's often perceived to be more profitable for an individual to convert a natural ecosystem than to leave it intact, even though the services it provides may be more valuable in total to a widely dispersed community. And we've talked about that a little bit, I think, in Energy Club before, about, you know, recognizing the inherent value of resources as they exist and not as the profits they could be. And particularly with corporations under a system like capitalism, it's very difficult to get, you know, a unilateral and a unanimous recognition of these resources as just inherently valued the way that they are, which is why legislation preventing ecosystem conversion is a critically important tool. And that legislation includes things like the national parks. You know, problematic as they have been and continue to be, they are still, you know, as I talked about earlier with the environmental benefits that they provide, they are still a very important part of our natural landscape. And I am, you know, in no way advocating for the abolition of the national parks here. But on the other hand of sort of schools of thought, we have the spontaneous and voluntary recognition of the need to maintain ecosystem services by individuals and communities is by far the earliest form of ecosystem protection. And this is what we're seeing a lot in sort of pushback against pollution and against just corporate policies, you know, running up against conservationist ideas. And community-driven conservation movements are still very widespread today, as evidenced by the fact that you're sitting in a meeting for one right now. Though they do sometimes fly a bit further under the radar than legislative sort of action does. And we have here in our lovely Minnesota, Voyageurs National Park, which is, it exists on Anishinaabe and Ocetishakowin Oyote land. It's the, you know, the land of the 7 Council Fires people, the land of the Dakota. And, you know, Voyageurs isn't one of the more, I guess, globally well-known national parks, but it is still, you know, it's here and it has a lot of the same problems as the other national parks that have been addressed above. And so it's important to recognize that this isn't just something that happens with the national parks out west. It's, you know, it exists in our state, and particularly with the history that our state has with the Dakota people. It's important to recognize this. So finally, what can you do? If you want to visit a national park, do your research first. Find out whose land you'll be visiting. There's a wonderful website here. Let's see. Is it still sharing?
Yep.
Okay. So if we scroll in here, you know, Voyager National Park is right about up here. And so you can see that that's part of Anishinaabe, Wake, and Ocetishakowin land. And over the rest of Minnesota, we've got Medewakantuan, Wapekute. There's a whole bunch of other, and you can look at, you know, they have global information. So if you're ever curious about what, you know, tribes, languages, treaties exist in different areas, I highly recommend looking at this resource. And then, sorry, so yeah, that's, I have all of my sources linked at the end, and the slides will be available on our website later if anyone wants to look at any of them. And yeah, questions, comments, concerns?
Well, I want to thank you for the presentation, and also for speaking a little bit of the Dakota language. That's a small way to help, you know, bring back the sound of the language. So that's something that I personally really appreciate. Also, I mean, I'm not of Indigenous heritage either, but it's beautiful to see other people doing that too. One thing that Jonte Maza, Dr. Neil McKay, his Dakota name means iron heart. And he was telling us about how a lot of the lands, sacred lands to the Dakota people along the Wakpatonka, the Mississippi River, that were, I mean, that still are like burial mounds. They're, you know, they've been bulldozed and, you know, turned into private property. And one of the things that he says is that, like, you know, even though the land has been defaced and, you know, the mounds aren't always there anymore, that the land is still, it still carries the same meaning and the same sanctity as it did before. And so an important part of it is like this is an issue obviously for national parks, but it's also like, even when it's not public lands, there are still many places where access and the right to live in truly like indigenous lifestyles, like the traditional lifestyles that indigenous people used to have, as opposed to the lifestyles they have today, where, you know, they're forced onto reservations that are not the land that is the land that they know as people, right, that their nation knows. And also, you know, like in a food desert where they can't find healthy food. And so obesity and alcoholism are rampant. So there's lots of issues connected to the same themes, Val, that you've brought up during this chat. So just want to raise awareness to that too, that like, it doesn't just need to be the national parks if you don't live near one. It can even be in your own neighborhood where we can start to fight to decolonize.
And especially for peoples who have been traditionally nomadic or migratory, being stuck, confined on the reservations, not allowed to hunt in their traditional lands that may be, you know, halfway across the continent from where they're currently located, is, you know, very damaging to culture and community and just the continuation of their existence.
I had a question. So you talked a little bit about like the efforts that groups are undertaking to kind of recognize the Native American land claims and all that. I was wondering, do you know if there are any like examples of national parks or state parks like actually giving up their land and giving them back to the nations they took from originally, or like anything else like that drastic, I guess?
I have not heard any, and I presume I would have come across it during my research had there been any, but it is possible I missed it. I don't believe that the national parks have ever ceded land back to Native tribes.
All right. Yeah, I was just curious to see if anybody had done that. But
I do think some of them have reopened like hunting, fishing, gathering sort of policies that had previously been closed, but not going so far as to actually return the land.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
On that note, kind of something that I kind of thought of when you were talking about how they basically pushed them off the like land that is now claimed as the national, what is it?
National park.
Yeah, national park. I don't know why I couldn't think of that name. And we're in Energy Club book club right now. We kind of had discussions of how sometimes when Native people are like hunting and gathering with the land, it can actually make that land more healthy and better than having no one on it at all. So I kind of was finding that interesting, like they're preserving these forests. They're saying they're preserving this land by making sure no one's on it, but like that could actually have a negative effect if like no one's on it, like using the trees for resources or like picking the sweetgrass that we talked about in our book. So there's just kind of a disconnect there that they might not realize.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and I do think that's one of the things the parks have started recognizing more recently is, you know, as the parks evolved and they found they were doing all of these preservation and conservation efforts, they started talking to Indigenous peoples and realizing, oh, this is stuff you were doing the whole time. Okay, that makes sense. And so I think that is part of what has prompted some of the national parks to start recognizing the Indigenous peoples and their heritage, their history, their traditions on that land, is because it is so integral to the, you know, continued success of those ecosystems.
To kind of add, Olivia and Val, to your comments is like, we're talking about this in a sustainability class. It's GCC 3025 if you're interested. It covers so many different topics. It's nuts. It's a really cool class. But one of the things that we were reading about last week was like this, depending on what opinion you hold, an incorrect conception of what wildness means. That like a wild landscape has to have no people in it, whereas like the lifestyles and ways of indigenous peoples is like they lived in harmony with the land. Like conservation wasn't a concept because they live in a way that is in balance with what nature can provide them. And so by removing them from the picture by force, like it actually, Olivia, like you said, like it throws things out of balance. So like it's really important for environmental health for them to actually be able to live the lifestyles that they've always had.
And we've seen that a lot with the increase in wildfires out west, and in particular with the increase in wildfires in Australia. People have been talking about how Indigenous people have been doing brush fires and they've done controlled burns for thousands of years. But when they were pushed off of that land, there was no one around to do that anymore. So it all built up and there was no new growth. And now we're getting these big sweeping firestorms, and because that's, it's nature saying, hey, you haven't done this for too many years, I have to reset. And it's very troubling that all of this could have been avoided by just listening to Indigenous voices from the start.
To me, like raises a little bit of a question, like when we go tree planting or we do these activities, like how would that be different if it was informed by an Indigenous person who like knows, or who like has learned from elders about the ecology of a certain place. Like maybe they don't know the Latin names of these plants, but they know how they behave and what water they like, and like which animals enjoy being around them and how everything thrives together because of traditions passed down from generation to generation. So just a curious thought. If there are no other questions, we are at time. So Val, I want to say thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm going to share my screen briefly in the last couple minutes here. Coming up, we're going to flip our schedule around. So we have another Sust chat next week. Nolan's going to discuss whether nuclear energy is or isn't a sustainable energy solution. And then after that, we're going to hear from Dr. Kate Knuth, who's going to talk about some of her work as a legislator in the city and the state of Minnesota. And then after that, we'll have another Sust chat with Val and Thomas, also exploring issues of sustainability in the digital age. So we hope you'll join us for those future meetings. If you haven't shared our email list with anyone, if you know of anyone who's interested in signing up, please share this short Z-link with them so that they can start to receive our emails. And if you haven't signed in, please go ahead and sign in here. And thanks everybody for coming. You can stick around for questions. Yeah, thanks for joining us.